Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to review one of the graphing problems in the Principles of Macroeconomics class, looking at labor markets and financial markets. And at this point in the semester, we're starting to transition from an overview of econ into the macroeconomics of it, really looking at macro specifically, looking at how whole economies, whole countries manage their economy, manage their scarce resources, and how we measure the health and well-being of a country and their economy. And so to transition from supply and demand in chapter 3 into labor and financial markets and into things like unemployment, interest rates, monetary and fiscal policy, labor and financial markets are a great way to do that because they take that traditional supply and demand model and apply it to a more macroeconomic phenomenon. Things like labor markets are going to give us things like unemployment. Financial markets are going to help us understand things like interest rates and the flow of money as we get into that space throughout the semester. So I think it's a nice little transition. It's also, if supply and demand were challenging, it's a little bit of a review. It does layer on some complicated stuff. Rules about price floors and price ceilings can be a little bit challenging. We'll talk about that in this problem, and we'll deal mostly with labor markets because that tends to be the easiest to understand, because financial markets can be a little bit more complicated. And while we might not have a sense of how we interact with financial markets, we definitely have a sense of how we and our loved ones, our friends and family interact in labor markets. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to flip over real quick and show y'all the problem. And then what I'm going to do today is I'm going to graph the answers up here on the whiteboard. We'll see how it goes. Let me know what you prefer. If you'd rather I do it on pen and paper, if that's easier, or if you'd rather I do it on the whiteboard. Sometimes I feel like the whiteboard's a little bit easier to work with, especially for kind of graphing things over and over again. And that is something I'll do, is kind of go over things a couple of times. So let me show you the assignment really quickly, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so the assignment up here goes through what the expectations are. And what we'll be doing is starting with a graph that is represented in the textbook. It's figure 4.2. It's one of the first graphs that the textbook will show you, whether it's the physical graph or the virtual online textbook. Either way, it's in the slides too, so it should be pretty easy to access this graph. But the truth of the matter is, you don't need to access the figure to be able to do this assignment. Really, all you need to do is remember that our labor markets are going to be graphed in XY space, with the quantity of labor on the x-axis and the cost of labor, the wage or salary, on the y-axis. And then we're going to have just sort of an average upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, and an equilibrium wage of $85,000 and an equilibrium quantity of labor. And quantity of labor can be measured lots of different ways: hours, days, minutes, people. And in this case, we're measuring it as 41,000 nurses, individuals in that labor market. And then what we're going to do is, after we graph that initial market, we're going to look at changes in a price floor, a minimum wage. We're going to talk about a $75,000 price floor and a $95,000 price floor, what it means for it to be binding and non-binding, and what the effect would be on the labor market, because that's one of the really important things to know. Is one of the things we want to do as economists in this context, in this space, in this class, we want to have a sense of how policies like a minimum wage law will affect that labor market. So we'll start off with that part, just talking about what would these different minimum wages do to the labor market. Then for part B, we'll talk about regulations for certification for nurses and what component of the labor market that's going to affect. So we're going to be talking about shifting one of those curves. Which direction does it shift? And what's the new equilibrium labor and wage or salary? And for these new equilibria, we're just kind of trying to get a sense of, are these numbers going up or down? And we don't need precise numbers because I'm not giving you precise data. We're just talking about a sort of the sense of the shift, right? Not being terribly technical, but I will ask you on the assignment to go ahead and graph that new curve so you can see the change in equilibrium. And then for the third one, we're going to do something similar. We're going to talk about an aging population, what we might see that do to the labor market. So this is going to be specifically talking about an increase in demand for healthcare services. How's that going to affect the demand for nurses, and what's that going to do to that graph? Which curve is going to shift, and what our new equilibrium is. So it should be pretty straightforward. Hopefully it's a nice review of supply and demand, and also a good introduction into these more macro worlds and measures, things like labor markets, unemployment, salary and wages. And of course, a lot of this is going to mirror or be really parallel to financial markets as well. So we're focusing on labor markets just on a whim. If you want more graphing practice with financial markets, let me know. I have an assignment, but I thought we would take it easy this week and just do one graphing assignment. So I'm gonna go ahead and close down the other screen, and we'll get it graphed up here on the board together and go through this problem step by step. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and pull up the textbook here. So I've got their graph and our graph, but like I said, you really don't need the textbook figure unless you want to be particularly precise. And honestly, the textbook figure is a little bit, when we use real data, we don't always get the easiest to see graphs. So let me make sure I get my whole whiteboard in there. And so what we're going to start out by doing is graphing the labor market for nurses. So we're going to start with our X and Y axis. And we want to label them. This is going to be the quantity of labor down here. And this is going to be the wage or salary. I think they use salary. So I'm going to do that, but it's not the end of the world, just as long as you have some notation for the cost of labor. And then I always like to label the top of the graph what this is. And this is nurses. And that can help sometimes as we move through questions about especially in demand and supply stuff, when you're talking about dimensions of non-price determinants that might affect the market, it's really helpful to remember what the market is and have it be clearly labeled. And then, like I said, we really don't need to be terribly precise here. We just want the intuition of a downward sloping demand curve. Oh, super duper love that. Oh, this pen is weird. All right. Sorry, blue pen. I'm going to try a different one. There we go. That's a better demand curve. So that's going to be the demand for nurses. And then this is going to be the supply for nurses. And one of the things that folks can often get tripped up on with labor markets is remembering a lot of times with supply and demand, we think of ourselves, consumers, people being on the demand. But in a labor market, the people are on the supply curve. It's workers supplying their labor to the market, right? So this is people who supply their labor to the market. Let's put it in a different color just to clarify. Workers, or in this case, nurses, supplying labor. And we know it's upward sloping because as salary increases, we're more willing and able to supply our labor to the market, right? We want to work for more money, not less. And then the demand side is going to be firms who demand or want to hire that labor to fill a position or to fill a job. And that's just an important clarification because it really can. I think that's a really common place where people get stuck on labor markets. And then just like it says in the problem, we have an equilibrium quantity of nurses, and that's going to be 41,000 nurses, and an equilibrium salary of, equilibrium salary of $85,000. And that is our first sort of starting point for this problem. So far, so good. We want to remember demand is always downward sloping because when we have to pay for something, we'd rather pay less. So we'll hire more workers if their salary is lower, fewer workers if their salary is higher. Just like if we're at the store and we're buying something, we'd like to buy more at a lower price than at a higher price. So far, so good. So now we're going to do the tricky kind of price floor, price ceiling component of it, where we're going to look at minimum wages. And so Part A says, what is the effect of a new mandatory minimum salary for nurses? If the minimum salary is, and I'll go ahead and write it down here, $75,000, then what is the effect? And then it also asks what the effect is if the new minimum wage is $95,000. And what I want you to think about here and answer in these questions, this isn't so much a graphing problem necessarily, although you can graph it, but what I want you to think about is which of these is a binding price floor and which of them, and what would be the effect of them. So we'll start out with the $75,000, and like I said, we've just got this intuitive graph here, but we can imagine that maybe this is where 75,000 is. It's going to be lower, right? And 95 is going to be up here, higher. So far, so good. At the $75,000 price floor, we see that that is a minimum wage below the equilibrium wage. And so that's like if you are making $20 an hour and the state of California raises the minimum wage to $19 an hour. It's not going to have an effect on you. You're already making more. And this is where price floors get tricky, because normally we think, oh yeah, the floor is on the bottom. That must be the thing we're talking about. But with a price floor, what we realize and what we need to kind of think about and remember is that when the floor is beneath equilibrium, that's normal and that's non-binding. So this would be a non-binding price floor or a non-binding minimum wage. And all that means is at $75,000, that new minimum wage law will not have an effect on the market. The average nurse is making $10,000 more than that. So this law, this new policy, will have no effect on the market, right? It's not going to alter anything because everyone's making more money than this new minimum rule. On the other hand, 95 is higher up. So if you're making $20 an hour and the state of California says you have to pay people $30, that's going to affect things. That's going to change your wage. That's going to be a binding minimum wage or a binding price floor. And that's because if the floor is over your head, if the floor is above equilibrium, that makes that equilibrium illegal. So if the floor is above you, you're doing something wrong. So that means that we're going to have to pay workers more. And if we offer nurses more money, more of them are going to want to supply their labor to the market, but fewer firms are going to want to demand that labor because it's gotten more expensive. If we go to the textbook, I believe at those quantities, what we would see is at $95,000, the quantity of labor supplied is going to be 48,000 workers or nurses willing to work, and only 39 jobs available for those workers. And so if you want to look at the slides, I'll pop it up for you so you can see that information, but they've got a table with that data in the current online version of the textbook. And so that means that more workers are going to want to work than there are jobs available for them. And that's going to give us a thing that we are familiar with in economics. That thing is a labor surplus, otherwise known as unemployment. There are more workers than there are jobs. And so if 48,000 nurses want to work and there are only 39,000 jobs, then what we're going to see is that at $95,000 minimum wage, we're going to have a labor surplus of 9,000 nurses. And for yours example, again, you don't have to use the graph and you don't have to use the textbook and the specific numbers. All you need to get is this intuition that if the wage is set too high, then more people want to work, then there are firms willing to hire them, and so we'll have that unemployment, that labor surplus. We don't need to know the number to know the reality of it. The higher the minimum wage, the greater the unemployment generally. And there's other factors that are going to play a role in this, but that's the general intuition that I want you to take away with it. So if the minimum wage is set too low, there's no effect. If the minimum wage is set very high, it's going to cause unemployment. And of course, we are skipping over a lot of nuance here and a lot of detail, but we're just trying to get a sense of how labor markets work, how they behave, and what we can say about them. And so to answer question 1, part A correctly, you would say, if there's a minimum salary of $75,000 in effect, it's not going to alter the market because it's non-binding. However, if the minimum salary rises to 95, that is going to have an effect on the market. It's going to generate a labor surplus. It's going to generate unemployment. It's going to mean there are more workers than jobs. So far, so good. Hopefully that wasn't too challenging. Now I'm going to go ahead and erase this. You don't have to graph all of this. I just graphed it all to try and give you a sense of it. But I'm going to go ahead and recreate our graph for the market for nurses to do part B and C. So for part B and C, we want to look at other factors that might alter the market for nurses. So I'm going to go ahead and put salary up here on the y-axis. And I've got quantity of labor on the x-axis. And I'm going to label my graph again, get my nice downward sloping demand curve right here, remembering that the demand for labor comes from firms hiring, and my supply of labor, which comes from people who want to work and supply their labor to the market rather than relax, that labor-leisure trade-off. And we want to go back to our initial equilibrium where we had 41,000 workers and an equilibrium salary of $85,000. Hopefully that's kind of legible. Here we go. All right, now we're going to look at Part B. Part B says, what is the effect of new regulations requiring additional certification for nurses? So we want to determine whether that's going to affect supply or demand, whether it's going to shift it out or in. And with demand and supply, again, we always talk about out or in because that's usually better than up or down in terms of clarity. You can also talk about to the right or to the left. I usually just say out or in because I feel like everybody knows what in and out are. And then we want to find a new equilibrium. If these curves shift, then that equilibrium is not going to be the same. So we'll start with part B, which is a new certification. So new certifications required, I'm just going to abbreviate, new cert required. Is that going to affect firms' ability to hire nurses or workers' ability to supply their labor as nurses? Certification is what allows you to do that job, right? The joke I always make is that I'll talk about this when I talk about labor markets in other classes where I'll say, you know, there's a lot of certifications required to become a dentist. But if you want, you can come over to my house and I'll do some at-home dentistry for like $20 a pop. We don't want that, right? We want certifications and education requirements for people in certain careers like nursing. We want to make sure they know what they need to do and have the required skills and training to do that job. But that means that not just anybody can become a nurse. To supply your labor to that market, you have to do some training and certification and those kinds of things. As we increase those certifications, it becomes harder to supply your labor to the market, right? So think about if you woke up tomorrow and wanted to be a nurse versus a Uber driver versus a bus driver, and how those different careers require different levels of certification, and so different amounts of time and sort of barriers to entering that labor market. So what we're going to see is that new certification is going to affect supply of nurses. And is it going to make it more nurses in the labor market or fewer nurses in the labor market? Well, a new certification makes it harder. So that's going to mean fewer nurses in the labor market, shifting that labor supply in. and I'm going to label it supply B, and I'm going to go ahead and write it out like that for myself as a reminder. And this is why we don't want to talk about up or down, because the supply curve technically went up, but really it went in. And when we look at the new equilibrium, we see, oh yeah, that is a lower quantity of nurses. And you can make up a number here. You can put in a placeholder. I'm going to say maybe that's 38,000, something like that. So now there are fewer nurses in the market because some people said, oh, you want me to get more training? It's not worth it to me anymore. I don't want to do that, or I don't have the time or the resources to do that, right? Scarcity means certification requires time and money, and not everybody has enough of that. So we'll have fewer nurses in the market. That's going to mean a lower quantity of labor. And we're also going to see a change in salary, right? Salary goes up because now it's more expensive to become a nurse, and there are fewer people doing that job. So we're going to see this salary go up some amount, maybe 90,000, maybe 95. I'm going to split the difference and say 92. There we go. That makes me happy. So that means that when the supply shifts in, we're going to see a increase in salary and a decrease in the quantity of nurses supplied. Well, just quantity of nurses overall. The equilibrium quantity has decreased. Does that make sense? So kind of generally, we have the curve shift in, we have the quantity in equilibrium go down, and the salary go up. So far, so good. Other factors that shift that labor supply curve are going to be things like immigration, right? If we passed a law that increased immigration of people with nursing skills, that would increase the supply of nurses. If we see more training for nurses, maybe schools opening up with doing specialized training for nurses, that would change the supply. Attitudes around nursing could change the supply, lots of things. The next question we want to do, I'm picking a fun pen color here. Let's go with this one, is part C. Part C says that now we have baby boomers aging. That's a reality, right? We are always aging, and the older people are aging. It seems more visibly than some other people. And so what that's going to mean is more healthcare services. So an increase in the population that needs healthcare services. So we want to ask first, is that going to affect the demand curve or the supply curve? And this is where it becomes important to remember that labor is a derived demand market. And that really is simple. It really just means that the demand for nurses comes from the demand for the work they do. So nurses supply a service to the market, and that service is healthcare. And so if people need more healthcare, they're going to need more people who do healthcare. And so this demand is derived from the services that the labor provides. So we're going to see an increase in aging baby boomers needing more healthcare services affect the demand side. And this time it's going to be an increase, shifting out to a higher quantity. And that makes sense, right? Intuitively, we understand, okay, if people need more healthcare services, they need more healthcare providers. And that's one thing that nurses do. They provide healthcare services. So that demand curve is going to shift out to a higher level. And I'm going to go ahead and label it demand C. And this is where, if you've done these curves all on one graph like I have here, it starts to get confusing. If you want to separate them out and do a new graph for B and a new graph for C, that's totally fine. It'll be a little bit clearer and easier. If not, it's not the end of the world. I haven't done it, and it's still perfectly clear to see what's going on. My next step, now that I've described that demand is going to shift out to a higher level, is I need to find the new equilibrium. So I'm going to compare this new demand curve to my original supply curve, because I'm taking these questions as one at a time. You could, if you wanted to, say, oh, we'll add it to the original supply curve, but then I might get an ambiguous outcome. And what I want to do is say, okay, starting from equilibrium, starting from that first part of the question, what happens if the demand increases? So if we see that demand increase, we get this new equilibrium here of a higher quantity of nurses being demanded, makes sense, higher equilibrium quantity, and also a higher salary. Maybe it's the same salary, maybe it's a little higher, maybe it's a little lower, but those are the big outcomes from this increased demand. The increased demand is going to tend to increase salary and increase the equilibrium quantity of nurses or labor in general. The big things that are going to alter demand in a labor market are going to be the demand for what that labor produces. So if you're a teacher and education is increasing in demand, that's going to affect demand for teachers. If you make pizza and people decide that pizza is gross, then that might mean a decrease in the demand for people who make pizza. Those kinds of things, that derived demand effect. The other thing that can play out on the demand side is going to be things like the other factors of production, right? And how they might influence your productivity. If workers become more productive, then their labor is worth more and firms are going to be more willing to hire them. And so there's a little bit more nuance in there of those factors that are going to be shifting that labor demand curve. But otherwise, that's it. That's the whole graphing problem. I feel like it's pretty straightforward. I know there's some weird, tricky things, remembering how minimum wages work, whether it's going to change the equilibrium or not, change the outcome, affect the market or not, remembering who's on the supply and who's on the demand curve for these things. But otherwise, hopefully it's a nice refresher of how to graph a curve, how to graph a market, how labor markets behave, and also what factors will alter labor markets. Things like policies around wages and certification, things like changes in the population, and changes in the workforce are all going to have an effect. We could also talk about Part C if we had changed it and said, hey, we have baby boomers aging. That might change labor supply if we have a lot of nurses retiring as they age out. And that would be a decrease in the supply of labor too. So there's a lot of ways to play around with this. And the whole idea is we model things this way so that economists can say to a policymaker, hey, I know you want to do this thing, but when you do, it's going to have this effect. You want to increase certification for nurses because we're worried about healthcare outcomes, but just so you know, it's going to make healthcare costs more expensive because we're going to see fewer people supply their labor to nursing. It's going to make it more expensive. And so we should expect healthcare costs for the state or for the nation to go up by this amount because of this new regulation. So that's why we model things this way, so we can talk about what our expectation is when we impose new policies. So that's it for the third graphing problem, a nice review of labor markets. Let me know what questions you have, and please do let me know if you like it better when I do graphs on the board or on paper. I feel like there's benefits to both, but for these kinds of graphs that really the assignment doesn't even need to be on a piece of paper, right? You don't even need to print this out. You can just read it off your computer or tablet or phone and write it on scratch paper, take a picture and send it in to me. This felt like a pretty easy way to get that done. Let me know what you think. Let me know what questions you have, and I will see you next time. Take care.